Don't open it until you're home.
Got it.
Hello?
She remembers for you. What?
The listing sat in the quiet corner of a forum the way a dead thing sits at the bottom of a pond. At first glance, you missed it, and then, if you looked twice, your eyes refused to look away. It had no photos, just a short, neat paragraph written in a voice that suggested business and discretion. Available. One living presence. Not for entertainment. Low traffic. Delivery in person. Price negotiable. Must have secure space. Mason found it at 3 a.m, the kind of hour when the city is a patient animal breathing slow and dangerous, and you can convince yourself anything is real if you have enough loneliness. He lived alone in a narrow apartment above a laundromat in a neighborhood that smelled faintly of bleach and burnt coffee. The rent was a trap. The job was a ledger of small indignities at a property management office. His channel, 4-digit subscribers, an earnest mic, a failing green screen, paid in compliments, and not much else. The algorithm favored outrage, so he tutored himself into cruelty for clicks. But his nights, unlit by success, were heavy. He told himself he was buying content. He told himself he was buying isolation therapy in a wrapped bundle. He told himself the listing was a prank and that he wouldn't reply. He messaged anyway. The seller answered in the same clipped tone. Not living in the conventional sense. Comes with history. Comes quiet. Won't bring attention. $250 cash. Pick up at 1 a.m. North Side. Bring equal part caution and curiosity. He was careful about the dark web because he had to be. Not because he was moral, but because mistakes cost money you didn't have. He wore a hoodie and used his real name only in the subject lines he couldn't help but fill. The seller sent a street address and an instruction. Take the 4th left off Marlowe. Wear shoes you can run in. The courier will hand you the package, close the door, and leave. No questions. Mason drove a city rental with a radio that only caught static between stations. The North Side on a weeknight was a carving of closed storefronts and houses with their lights low. He parked too far from the address and walked, hood up, the city pressing around him like a second skin. The house at the end of the lane was older than most, a clapboard thing whose porch leaned like a bowed head. A single light glowed in the upstairs window. The courier was a small man with long fingers and an expression like he'd been taught to hide whatever he felt. He handed Mason a box the size of a shoebox wrapped in brown paper and tied twice with twine. There was no invoice, no name, only a strip of yellowed tape with a corner of an old photograph. A young woman's face, eyes half hidden by a fringe. The instant Mason touched the paper, he felt colder, as if the night itself had folded into his palms. He didn't open it in the car. He took it home, sat on the living room floor, surrounded by the hum of his refrigerator and the blue light of his laptop, and slit the twine with a butter knife until the box yielded a small carved music box, a brittle dress the size of a child's, and a folded note. The note read, "She remembers for you. Do not call her anything but the name in the locket. She does not leave when called. She is quiet when she is respected. M." The locket had a name inside, Elsie. That night, Mason turned the music box. The tune was off-key, a child's lullaby that sounded like someone humming behind a thick wall. The apartment did the things small apartments do. Amplified small noises into the shape of other people. The dishwasher making a false conversation. The heating system exhaling like a tired man. At 2 a.m., the light above his sink flicked. He told himself it was a loose wire, something mechanical and stupid. He told himself all the things you tell yourself when you choose to believe in ordinary explanations. But the music box kept playing on its own, silent-handed, even after he had wound it down. Against reason, Mason found himself speaking to the air. Elsie. His voice felt strange, like a voice reading a line it had rehearsed. "Elsie, are you here?" The room answered with the soft metallic clink of the music box. He felt, inexplicably profoundly, a presence. Not a shadow falling across the wall, not a whimper of cold air, but something like attention. A weight on the edge of the world. Over the next days, the city remained unbothered. The dark web forum erased the listing as if it had never existed. Mason put the music box on a shelf behind his streaming camera, where the ring light picked at the brass, and he began to talk to it on his live streams. At first, he made a joke about occult merchandising, and his chat flooded with laughing emojis. Then his viewers tuned in for the wrong reasons and the right ones. They wanted to test him. They wanted to watch fear be manufactured on demand. Mason obliged. Elsie, if that is what she was, moved slower than the internet expected. Her manifestations arrived like a rumor. The scent of rain inside, long after it had stopped raining outside. The taste of pennies in his mouth after he slept. The sound of footsteps in the apartment above that never materialized into a neighbor pounding on drywall. He recorded a late-night stream and asked his viewers to make noise, to create something. They chanted the locket name, Elsie, Elsie, in chat. 1,000 typed voices pressed into a digital throat. The music box turned on its own. A camera he had left unplugged blinked to life for 3 minutes, and then died. The chat spiked with conspiracy and donations. Mason's subscriber count ticked. The innards of his life, the parts he had learned to monetize, ripened around the spectacle of something strange. But that first weekend, when he brought a friend home to watch, a blunt, kind guy named Marcus with a ceramic mug of bad coffee, the apartment grew cold enough to fog the glass of the window behind them. Marcus laughed at first, then laughed less. He twisted the locket open and felt a drop of water beat on the brass and crawl like a thinking thing. "Someone's messing with you, man," Marcus said finally, voice smaller than his jokes. "Or you finally cracked." The music box answered with a lullaby that no one had played. The room filled with a voice like rust on a bell. Mason felt it like a claim. When he slept, the dream came in the clean, terrible clarity that only deep fatigue permits. A girl in a faded dress standing at the foot of his bed, hair cropped like a boy's, eyes the color of weather. She held the locket out to him, and when he tried to take it, the metal burned his fingers and left something dark and soft behind his nails. He woke up convinced he'd imagined it, convinced it was a fever, but there was something pressed into his palm. A small scrap of the same brittle dress, the edges torn like a memory. He did not call the seller back. He did not return the music box. He wound it again. The city watched. His subscriber count rose. His viewership loved the unexplained. He realized in a precise, flattened moment that he had not bought a person. He had bought a thing that had known a person, and the person, or what remained of her, had come home. People expect haunting to be loud. They expect doors slamming, faces at windows, blood on the ceiling. Horror, in the films and the chat rooms, translates into clear cinematic damage. The truth morphs around smaller engine sounds, memory working like a motor, grinding old gears. Elsie was a quiet machinery of grief. By the second week, the apartment operated on new rules. The music box lived on a shelf behind Mason's mic. It never left its spot. Several times he tried to throw it into the trash, and later found it back on the shelf as if it had learned the layout of his apartment and preferred the view from behind his camera. The lullaby seemed to slow down when he was mean on stream, and when he apologized in a genuine voice, it quickened, as if fed on kindness. Mason wasn't a believer unless the belief paid his bills. The search for viewers, for traction, had become a substrate for his curiosity. He invited researchers, a skeptic with a trimmed beard, a woman from a local occult bookstore who smelled of oil and old paper. He recorded every session. "No staged equipment," she said, running her fingers along the music box. "But be aware. Some things come attached to people, and some things shouldn't be forced to perform." Elsie, she observed, did not like bright lights. "She remembers through objects," the woman told Mason late one night while the chat read like a stream of commands and emotes. "Not exactly alive, not exactly dead. It's memory-bound. She's a pressed film, and pressed film is fragile. On camera, the presence behaved like a child testing new rules. It would mimic the sound of Marcus walking up the building's stairs, a clatter on the radiator that made Marcus swear and the chat roar with laughter. Then, later, leave a wet footprint on the kitchen linoleum shaped like a shoe of someone half his size. It rearranged spoons into tiny piles. It left messages, if they could be called that. Patterns of condensation in the bathroom mirror that spelled a single word sometimes, or a string of letters that read like an old radio signal. Once, after a night of rain, it left a smear on the inside of his living room window. Small handprints, spaced like someone used to short limbs. "People don't realize how relational ghosts can be," the occult woman told him off the air. "They exist where they've been thought of. They're made and remade by memory." That principle proved both tender and terrifying. Mason began to bring Elsie things. A chipped cup with a blue rim, a paperback of fairy tales, a jar of petrified pennies he collected off the street. He joked on stream that he was feeding her. When he left bread on the table, the crumbs were arranged into a small ridge, a private furrow. He could not say for sure whether he was being kind or cruel. He started to hear a voice that wasn't anyone he knew. Not at first words, just low, wet syllables that rose out of the brass of the music box when the room was quiet. like someone at the far side of the house making small offerings. When the voice finally shaped itself into language, it used the old grammar of children. "Where is my house?" "I can't find it," the voice said once into his pillow. He sat bolt upright, sweating despite the cold. "Who are you?" he whispered. That was the only kind of question ghosts ever answer. A question asked in the dark where sound can find a shape. "A place used to be," she said. "They took it. They kept the door closed." Her syntax was postcard faded. Her nouns were houses and names rather than modern nouns. Swing, river, mama. She did not ask for things like money or phones or food. She wanted a door to be opened. Mason told the story on the stream. He felt foolish doing it at first. It read like indulgence. But the chat became a jury. Some called him a fraud. Some called it performance art. A few typed slow, pale sentences that suggested they believed. Someone in the chat sent him a message off-platform. An address in a town 3 hours from the city. The name of a church long since deconsecrated. "If you want to learn her story," the private message said, "start here. Small-town history is cheap to find." He drove on a gray morning with the seat heater on and the music box in a padded duffel bag on the passenger seat. The church was a silhouette of boarded glass and a stoop eaten by ivy. The clerk at the Historical Society looked like she was part ledger and part regret. She fetched a box of microfiche and a manila folder with brittle newspaper clippings. The headlines were the same small tragedies local papers prefer. "Young girl lost in flood. Family grieves for missing daughter." The dates were old enough for grief to be archival. A photograph fell from the folder. A group of children with their knees on the ground and faces sunburned. A girl sat at the center with cropped hair and a dress so faded it looked pale as dust. She had the wind-sifted eyes Mason had stared at on the strip of tape that came with the package. The margin note read, "E. Harris, Elsie 1997, found by river." "Found?" Mason said, the syllable a rock in his mouth. "Washed ashore after the storm," the clerk said. "Family took her in for a while. Then there was talk. She was quiet after. You know how kids are after trauma. Report says she wandered, couldn't sleep." She flipped through the typed file slower than necessary. "Sometimes they disappear. Sometimes they leave. Not a lot else recorded." He felt something like a bruise form over the edge of his chest. The music box hummed in the duffel bag like a small animal. He thought about the seller's note. "She remembers for you." Remembering for someone else was a kind of labor. Remembering for someone else meant replacing that someone's memory with your own. That night, back in his apartment, the chat watched him hold the photograph to the camera. Elsie's face filled the screen. The lullaby slowed, Miss Wrong, and then, as if cueing to his hands, a single tear of condensation crawled down the inside of his window and landed on the photograph like a drop of old weather. "You shouldn't have brought her," Marcus said on the phone. His voice was low. "Do you get that? You didn't summon a thing to make content. You summoned a person who had been hurt." Mason did not have a defense for the way the world works when you are desperate. He had used every pocket of the city to fund attention. Pranks, confessions, staged terrors. Here was something that refused to be harnessed in a tidy story. Here was a human ledger, ragged and real. Elsie became less a novelty and more a mirror. She reminded Mason what it is to be watched without the intention of being liked. She replayed the small violences that had made her. Thunder at a window, the cold that comes through an old house's bones, the taste of river mud. He listened, and if he was honest, he recognized the pattern of his own life in the way she asked for doors. He recognized that he himself had been trying to buy an exit from loneliness. One night she named someone who was not him. "Marcus," she said, and the name fell with a weight that made him flinch. He left the door open. "Who?" he asked. "Not him." "The other," she whispered. "A man like rain. He took my voice so I wouldn't scream." She did not accuse with speech. She accused with patterns. A bruise that moved across the photograph overnight. A voice that said the shape of a name and then swallowed it like a stone. Mason found himself searching old obituaries, town hall minutes, a shred of rumor on a forum thread someone had closed because it got messy. The trail was cold, but the cold had texture. Neighbors with thin mouths. A record of a man convicted of minor theft, who later vanished from the papers. A pattern that didn't quite add up. "Do you want me to help you?" Mason asked the music box one night. The chat hummed. The lullaby wound itself on a single note. She did not answer like a person would. She answered like something that had been taught to be patient. "Help me open the door," she said. It was a request that seemed simple until he tried to imagine the meaning of it. To open her door might mean to find the place where she last stood. It might mean to give her back what had been taken. It might mean breaking a seal you were not supposed to touch. The line between empathy and spectacle blurred until Mason could not tell where the camera's rectangle ended and the apartment's grain began. He had a choice. Make the search into content and trade her history for clicks, or let her story remain a private, tender violation. He was not a good man exactly, but he was not a monster either. The way forward would test both. There is a moment in every search where the map flickers. A detail appears that reframes the journey. For Mason, it came in the form of a name scribbled on the back of a receipt he had received when he paid the courier. M. Harris. Delivery. He had tucked the receipt into a drawer and forgotten it until, in a small practice panic one afternoon, he rifled through his desk and found it again. Mason called the number on the receipt. A woman with a voice like newspaper answered, and then hung up when he mentioned Elsie. He left messages. He pressed on blogs and cross-indexed names. The trail did not get brighter. It narrowed. What if we go to the river? The occult woman suggested. Sometimes the living leave things where the dead were found. It is a superstition dressed as logic, but superstition has a way of working where sensibility fails. They drove out of the city with a long, taut silence. The chat that had once been the horizon of his world was quiet today, because Mason had chosen not to stream the trip. Away from the glow of screens, everything acquires texture, the world resuming at a scale you haven't used in a while. The river they found was a braided thing, half-dead reeds, and water the color of old coins. A wind tried to make words of the reeds. He dug near the bank because digging feels like progress. The shovel bit mud and folded it away. The occult woman watched, hands tucked in her coat, not unkind. Marcus watched with a knotted expression like a man with one foot in two lives. They found fragments. A child's shoe button, a strip of fabric that matched the brittle dress, a flattened brass trinket with Elsie's name stamped inside. The things were arranged too precisely, as if someone had made sure heirlooms survived the water's teeth. Mason felt hope like a fever. "We can close this," he said aloud. "We can find who did this. You are not allowed to make atonement for crimes you did not commit by excavating old wounds." That moral law, banal and cold, hung over them like winter. But human grief has a way of convincing you otherwise. They followed a paper trail from the river to a boarded house on the outskirts with paint blistering in the sun. A neighbor with a voice like gravel told them the house had belonged to a man who kept to himself, and who had taken in odd labor for a while after his wife left. "Real quiet he was," she said. "Kept to his tools. Folks said he had strange visitors. Inside the house, dust lay in the sun like ash. There was a smell that happens whenever a house has been abandoned long enough for the past to become a second property. Old plastic, mildew, the thing left behind that remembers being loved." In the back room, they found a door hidden behind shelves. An inner door that looked like it had not been opened in decades. It had a brass latch and a carved pattern like water. When Mason saw the latch, his mouth went dry. It was not the sound of a latch catching that made him key his breath, but the sudden pressure of recognition. Elsie's voice had asked for a door to be opened. And here, in a small house of old men and rumors, the door waited like a secret spelled in wood. They opened it together. The smell rose like wet paper. Inside the room were things arranged as if for a small coffin. A child's bed frame, a mound of clothing, and on a table, a music box that matched the one Mason had bought. A photograph lay there, edges browned like toast, of a family in which a girl stood with her head cocked. There were marks on the floorboards that suggested someone had been tied there, the evidence of small cruelties made visible in the way wood remembers pressure. No courtroom dramatization followed, no TV-ready confession. There were only muted facts, and a space inside Mason that filled with the shape of guilt he could not claim. "Someone was keeping her," Marcus said, voice low. "Not," he swallowed. "Not like they say on the internet. Like someone thought they were saving her. Or they were showing her something. This is me speculating, man." The house told them the rest in small filings. A neighbor produced a journal with lists and prices and names. A man who had once rented rooms there now lived in a halfway house. His memory was disjointed and medication smoothed. But he had been there the night the girl came with a man who smelled of river mud. He said he found her on the shore, the man remembered. Said she shouldn't be alone. Said he would keep an eye on her. All at once, a terrible pattern clicked into place that made Mason's hands tremble. The seller's terse M. On the note, the receipt with M. Harris, the sheltered house that thought of itself as a refuge. It had been a refuge with bars. It had been a place where someone had tried to make her safe and failed. It had been a place where someone tried to keep a life as private property under the guise of care. Mason felt angry and ashamed at once. When they returned to the city, the music box turned itself slowly on the dash like a slow heart. Mason left it running that night and watched the footage back in the morning. On the recording, the lullaby bent under a faint additional noise. A whisper. 2 syllables. A breath shaped like gratitude. "Thank you," the voice said. Not the language of accusation, but the hush of something relieved. The chat, belated, spilled over with donations and messages. Theories and condolences and malicious joy. For a moment, Mason felt the cheap ecstasy of having solved a puzzle. He uploaded footage and the views climbed. Then a small private thing happened that no analytic metric could explain. The music box cracked and stopped. The brass seam hairline and then gone. And in the morning, when he checked the shelf, there was nothing but a locket lying open with one photograph curled like a page left in a book. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, in a hand like a child's, "Doors open. I am going home." Mason believed it for the first time the next night, when the apartment finally felt like a place where somebody had left and not left a hole. The music box did not wind again. The wind through the vents lifted the dust in simple patterns. He dreamed of a river, and in the dream, Elsie ran with water at her ankles, hair cropped and free like the edges of a map. For a week, nothing happened except the ordinary. The algorithm blinked and his numbers normalized. The occult woman said things like, "Some things remember what they are when they find the threshold." Marcus came over and drank coffee that was too hot, and stayed to watch movies he had seen 100 times. Mason's life rebalanced in small increments as if weighted. He thought that was the end, that he had opened the door and the door had taken what it needed. But horror has a way of returning in footnotes. On a late rainy night, months later, Mason received a small envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a scrap of brittle cloth and a single line written in pencil. "Thank you for keeping the light on." He went to the window and looked down at the street. For a second he thought he saw a figure at the far end of the block. Small, half in the rain. He blinked and it was gone. The city made a habit of erasing things you needed to keep alive. He told himself he had been helped by the dead, that whatever debt had been there was settled. He told himself he had not been complicit in the harm he had exposed. He told himself many things. But at night, sometimes the music box's lullaby returned. Not in sound, but in memory. A note that had once bent to the shape of a child's call. He would reach for nothing, and find, in his palm, the warmth of the locket as if someone had just taken it and set it there. An imprint of a hand that had learned to be gentle. Elsie never came back in the way the feed wanted. She did not lean into scripts. She did not become the spectacle everyone typed for. She existed after the way a person exists after someone remembers them with attention rather than ownership. The dark web had been a portal for a wrong impulse. The idea that a person could be purchased and performed. What Mason learned, with an economy of painful revelations, was this. Some doors must be opened, and when you do the right thing, you do not get applause so much as a quiet, inconvenient responsibility. You must listen afterward, repair what you can, and understand that finding the truth does not make you a healer so much as a witness. In the end, the channel settled back into quasi-normalcy. The late-night streams became less sensational, more human. He spoke sometimes without the ring light, about small mercies, about the things that haunt us because we refuse to look at them. Once, on the anniversary of the night he bought the box, a single new subscriber appeared in his count with a username that read simply, Elsie 1997. Mason stared at the number until the screen blurred. He smiled then, small and tired, the kind of smile that nudges at a wound and promises you will not leave it alone. He clicked on the subscriber and the profile had no posts, only a single image. A girl at the edge of a river, hair cropped, face tilted like a question. He did not call out. He did not demand a sign. He wiped a hand across his eyes and shut his laptop. Outside, the city kept breathing, and somewhere, maybe, a ghost walked home.